Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on sustainable purchasing, how to sell to local government. We're so glad you could all join us this afternoon. We have two experts here to talk about city budgeting as well as sustainable purchasing, so I'm just going to turn it over to them. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat function or send a question to share that with us, and then we will read out the questions after the presentation. So I will I will introduce our first speaker, Satya Rhodes-Conway, who works for the Mayor's Innovation Project. And Satya, take it away.
Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be here today, and thanks everybody for dialing in. Let me just say a minute about the Mayor's Innovation Project. We're a national learning network for mayors and their senior staff, and we focus on the high road of equity, sustainability, and democracy. Our website is mayorsinnovation.org if you're interested in learning more. And it looks like you have Stacy's slides up, not mine. Or I don't know if you were going to introduce her. There we go. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to talk about is just a really sort of brief overview about working with local governments, and then Stacy will talk more specifically about sustainable procurement. So if I can have the next slide, this is really just a sort of 101 for folks who aren't familiar with local government or haven't worked in the local government sector before, about what cities are like and how they work or think about procurement. And the first thing to know is that all cities will think that they are unique, but they have a lot of commonalities. And yet it is really important to know the details of the particular city that you want to work with. And the things to think about are who is making the decisions. Is it a city manager? Is it a mayor? Is it a city council? Is it a department head that you might be working with? But to really understand who's the ultimate decision maker on a purchasing decision or process. It's important to know the timeframes, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. And it's important to know a little bit about the local context. What are the priorities of the decision makers? Does the city have any sort of overarching goals that they've adopted or that they're working on? Where does the project come from? Is it just, sort of basic sort of regular supplies that are being procured, or is there a larger context here? And then don't necessarily assume that these things are the same from place to place. There are sets of cities that have commonalities, but like I said, the deeper motivations or the priorities of a particular city may be different in different cities. Let's have the next slide. So to talk a little bit more about who might decide, again, it might be a mayor, it might be a city council, it might be a city manager, it might be the budget office, it might be the purchasing office, or it might be a department head, or in some cases it might be a purchasing officer within a department, or even line staff for some purchases, depending on the size and type of the purchase. And so again, just doing a little bit of research up front is worthwhile so that you know you're talking to the right person or you're in the right department. Some of this can probably be found online or in, for example, the agendas and minutes of previous meetings. Some of it you might just have to pick up the phone and ask who's the right person to talk to. And in my experience, I mean, there are some cities that have sort of online or phone systems like a 311 system where you can ask any question. In other cities, if that doesn't exist, I've often found that it'll be the person at the front desk at either the mayor's office or the clerk's office or the city manager's office that probably knows just about everything and can direct you in the right direction. I want to take a moment and talk about what kind of money gets used for city purchasing and contracting. it's important to know what kind of money you're talking about, because there are different restrictions on different types of money. So many cities, maybe even most, get some kind of money from the federal government. This might be dollars from HUD for housing-related things. It might be CDBG or Community Development Block Grant money for community improvements. Anyway, there's a whole range. It might be related to water utilities. It might be related to fire departments. It might be related to police departments. There's a whole range of federal programs that provide funding to local governments. And generally, these monies have a decent amount of requirements and restrictions on them. Some of them having to do with the wages that must be paid by anybody who is working on federal money, others having to do with the level of reporting that's required by the local government back up to the federal government. But in general, these are is sort of unwieldy funds to work with, and you can expect, if you're working on federal dollars, to have a little bit higher level of scrutiny on the contract and then on the reporting for the contract. State pass-through dollars, similarly, they might be around human or community services, they might be around utility services, and they might be around economic development. And there's probably going to be, again, some level of reporting that's required and some restrictions on how those funds can get spent. And so just being familiar with what the rules are is pretty important. Many cities will borrow money from the private market, usually in the form of bonds, and often this borrowing goes for more capital expenditures. So it might be road construction, or it might be the purchase of a new transit bus, or to build a new fire station, or whatever large sort of capital expenditure a city might have. And these funds are borrowed at a particular rate, and they're paid back over time, often in 10, 20, maybe 30-year range. And this is a little less restricted than the federal or state funds. Mostly it's going to be governed by whatever rules the city has about its procurement. And then there's what is often called operating dollars, which is monies that come off of tax levies. It might be your property tax, it might be a sales tax, it might be a local income tax. And this is sort of the working capital of the local government. It's how they purchase, certainly how they pay most of their employees, and it's how they purchase most of the sort of everyday supplies, uniforms, paper, computers, cleaning supplies, whatever it might be that a city needs. And that's mostly going to come off of taxes. Some of it, another revenue stream that cities have or local governments have is fees. Think of like parking ticket fees, but also think of like deed recording fees, or business license fees, or things like that you might encounter. Those are generally smaller revenue streams, and generally are used for the program that is generating them. So they might go into the operating budget of a program. The parking ticket fees might go back to parking enforcement, for example. And then there are sort of impact or dedicated fees. A common example of this is a perk impact fee, where new development, on the assumption that the folks living in the new development will use the parks, they have to pay an impact fee to the Parks Department, which then will use it to improve parks or to create new parks. And so here again, the restriction is that the thing that is generating the fee is where the money will get spent. And then there are utilities or enterprise funds, and this will be like your water utility or your sewer utility or your stormwater utility, or sometimes there's a parking utility, or there might be a municipal energy utility. And these tend to be more or less budgets unto themselves for the purposes of purchasing. So the ratepayer dollars, for example, that your water utility generates, you pay your water bill, that money goes back to the water utility and is used generally for the water utility. There are exceptions to all of these things, but the important thing for purchasing here is to know that utilities are often going to be doing their own purchasing with their own utility funds. Let's have the next slide, please. So I want to say a bit about budget cycles, and that can implicate all of the sorts of funding that we just talked about. This is generally an annual cycle, starting with planning. And let me start by saying that this will run on a fiscal year. For some cities, the fiscal year is the same as the calendar year. In other cities, it is not. It might be a July to July. It might be something else. That's also a good thing to know about the city that you want to be working with. But whenever the fiscal year starts, it will start with budget planning. That might be based on a strategic plan. It might be based on a set of outcomes if the city does outcome-based budgeting. It might be based on input from elected officials, certainly from department heads, sometimes from citizens. But you're going to start with some set of information that goes into budget planning, and that usually will happen in the mayor's office or the city manager's office. And so that budget planning gets rolled into budget development. All of the different department budgets will go up to either, again, the mayor or the city manager. The finance office will be working on revenue projections. How much do you expect to come in taxes and fees, et cetera? What's the federal government going to do this year? Some sort of citywide expenditure stuff. What are we going to have to pay for insurance? That'll all be figured out in there. The executive, either again the manager or the mayor, will propose a budget. Often it's split into capital and operating. There'll be some sort of approval process. Usually there's a public input process. Often there are amendments. Then the legislative body will approve, and the executive will adopt. And then you'll start that budget in the beginning of the next fiscal year. So the adopted budget usually is adopted at the end of one fiscal year and starts at the beginning, obviously, of the next. Throughout, there is budget maintenance. Obviously, cities are keeping tabs on where they're at, and there will be changes or amendments through the legislative body over time. Why is this important for you if you care about selling to a local government? It's important because the budget really controls particularly the large expenditures that a city can make. And so often departments can't move money between sort of major item budget lines, right? They might be able to move small amounts of money between minor items within their budget, but they probably will need council approval to make any big budget changes. So if you are looking for a big contract with a city, or if you're just looking to know what a city is going to be spending money on, a budget is someplace, and the budget process is a place that you should be paying attention so you know what their priorities are, where they plan on spending money, or, for example, if you're interested in selling them, say, solar panels, that might be an item that would need to be in the budget in order for it to go smoothly from there on out. Next slide, please. All right, so from the business perspective, what are the opportunities here? The sort of most traditional way is through a request for proposal or request for qualification process. You'll know this as your RFP or RFQ. Mostly when cities want to buy something, they're going to put out an RFP and say, we need to buy T-shirts for our fire department. We need to buy 10 printers for our offices. We need to buy, this type of software for our IT department. And they'll put that RFP out there. They are usually advertised certainly on the city website, but often through the sort of aggregator purchasing systems, which if you're not familiar with, you probably ought to be, that will sort of roll up all these different municipal RFPs, and you can see what's available in your industry. And different cities have different processes around this, but there's some response. You say what you can do for what amount of money, and they have some process to evaluate the bids and choose a winning bid. And different, again, this is a place that it sort of matters what city you're dealing with, if that's going to be a quick process or a longer process. Often smaller amounts of money move through quicker. Bigger contracts will take longer. There might be a review committee. It might have to be approved by council, etc. There are also, in some cases, a sole source contract. This is when the city believes that you provide a unique service or product that they want, and they want to, that for whatever reason they feel like they, if they went out to bid, there would not be another respondent, or that it would not be the service or product that they wanted, and so they're going to award a sole source contract to a particular supplier. And again, this is usually in the case where there is some sort of unique product or service that is being provided. On a rare occasion, you can get a budget allocation specifically for a particular item, or again, usually through a sole source contract. And that might be, again, where a city knows that they need a particular thing from a particular entity, whether that's a company or a service provided by a nonprofit, and they write that directly into the budget. The other sort of opportunity here is to leverage the purchasing preferences that many cities have adopted. Most will have some sort of purchasing preference for minority and women-owned businesses. And so you'd need to figure out, if you fall into this category, you need to figure out how to register with the local government as one of these. Often it's similar. They might accept the federal definitions, they might accept a state definition, or they might have their own registration process. Similarly, small and local businesses, they might have their own definitions of what that is. Some places have pretty broad definitions of what counts as local. Others have a relatively strict definitions, or a scale of local, so that if you are literally within the city, you might get more preference. If you're within the same county, you might get a lesser preference. And if you're within the same state, you might get an even smaller preference. But it's important to look at these if you are trying to sell to local governments near you, because it can give you an advantage in a bid process. And this is often the way these things are structured, is to give you a couple of points for being local in a bid process, which, all else being equal, would put you ahead of your competitors. And what we're talking about today, obviously, is sustainable or environmentally friendly purchasing. I'll defer to Stacy for a bigger discussion of that, but just to know again that many places have adopted these preferences, and so being sort of familiar with the specifics of them and how your products fit that is important, and definitely a selling point for those cities. Some cities also have, for example, a sweat-free purchasing requirement. This is mostly for apparel. Some might have adopted fair trade, although doesn't really apply to a lot of things that cities buy. But just knowing that these things exist, and that if you sell that type of product, you can take advantage of these preferences, is an important thing to do. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, and then we can hear a little more specifically about the sustainable purchasing. I think it's important for you as a business person to think about, what does your city want to do, the city that you're trying to work with, and what are their goals? Do they have climate goals? Do they have environmentally friendly purchasing goals? Do they have energy efficiency goals? Do they have water use goals? Do they have an emphasis on fair wages? Do they Are they particularly interested in developing a particular area of town or a particular industry, or just thinking about what are their goals and how do you and your service or product fit into those goals? How can you help them reach those goals? And being able to articulate that, not just in a sort of traditional RFP process, but also in your interactions with local government leaders, department heads, elected officials, sort of being in that mix so they get to know you and know what you provide, so that if the need does come up, they'll think of you. And then to think about internally within the local government, who wants to do the thing, to put the solar panels up or to purchase a hybrid bus. Who's your internal champion going to be for what you want to do? And how do you form a relationship with them? And how do you help meet their needs around what they're trying to do? And then you should be thinking about who can find the money to do it. And it might be the same person, right? It might be your internal champion that has access to the budget process or the purse strings, but it might not. Traditionally, the folks that can find the money would be, maybe department heads, certainly the finance office, mayor's office, city manager, and to a certain extent, city council. But be thinking about the fact that who your internal champion might be is maybe not the same person that can get something into the budget. And then you want to be really careful about what the rules are. If a city has a real emphasis on sort of open and fair purchasing process and everything is run by bid, you want to think about how you can be in the strongest position possible to take advantage of that. If a city is, sort of interested in, maybe they have an innovation office that is interested in trying a bunch of stuff and doesn't do a bid process, but sort of forms partnerships with different companies to try things out. How do you talk to those people and get to be a part of that program? What are the rules around selling to the local government that you're interested in? And how can you be as respectful as possible of those rules, obviously follow them, but also make them work for you? Next slide, please. I think that might be it.
Oh, yep, that's great.
Okay, so let me just say then, just in conclusion, that in general, I mean, cities buy a lot of stuff, right? I think for this crowd and to think about sustainable procurement, it's important to think about how the sort of more sustainable product or service it can help a city meet its goals, and communicating that well. And then I'll just plug again our website, mayorsinnovationproject.org. Happy to connect with folks. Certainly send your local government folks our way, but if you're interested in connecting with our audience, with the mayors and city staff that we work with, feel free to drop me a line and we can have a conversation about that.
Great. Thanks so much, Satya. So next we have Stacey Foreman, the City of Portland, Oregon, and she's going to talk a little bit more about sustainable thinking about more environmental preferable purchasing.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Stacey Foreman. I serve as the Sustainable Procurement Coordinator at the City of Portland, Oregon. And just real briefly, I'll mention that I am housed in our Central Procurement Services office. We're an office of about 40 staff, made up of procurement professionals as well as some compliance staff and outreach staff. So next slide. So I'm going to talk just a brief overview to add on to what you just said about procurement. I'm going to describe a little bit about how our procurement works and get into a little bit about our sustainability goals here to provide some context as to why we have a sustainable procurement and program and what we do here in implementing it. So next slide. So all of our procurement rules are housed in our city code. They are based off of, largely based off of our state procurement rules. They are customized a little bit for local government and our goals and priorities here. Some things to know about how we differentiate those rules is there are slightly different, there are some unique things depending on what we're buying, whether it's construction, goods or services, professional services or IT. The rules differ a little bit by what we're buying. But in general, the higher the dollar value of what we're buying, the more centralized and formal the procurement process. As previously mentioned, we utilize a lot of different solicitation types when we are doing a formal procurement. So we use low bids processes, we use the request for proposal process where we're evaluating more just low price. We're evaluating project experience, project approach, etc., and we award to the highest score proposal in that particular case. We also use cooperative contracts though, so we may piggyback off of a state contract or a contract through a cooperative purchasing organization like U.S. Communities. So all of those are ways that we get the variety of things that the city buys. Next slide. So in terms of elaborating on that just a little bit more in terms of how we engage with suppliers. So for small purchases, small dollar amounts, it's pretty informal. Employees can go out and they can use their city procurement card online or local stores. As you climb up the dollar value and you get into more of what we call an intermediate purchase range, things get a little more formal in the sense that we have to get oral or written quotes. And then when we get into the larger purchases, that's when we get the more formal solicitation process going. More of those go through here, our central office, and our professional staff assist our departments in developing the solicitations and getting those contracts in place. All these solicitations are posted on our online procurement center where if you're registered as a vendor in our system, you get an email notification according to the type of commodity that we're soliciting and how you classified the services or goods that you provide. Something to note, as mentioned, there are lots of different ways that cities advertise these kinds of things. We just happen to have our own online procurement center, but it could be, for example, here in Oregon, lots of cities also just advertise through the state's online procurement center and use that method instead. Next. So moving on to sustainability, here at the City of Portland, we do have a long history and variety of sustainability-related policies and programs and initiatives. And the thing to know is that they do cover quite a few different topics. So there are lots of different ways to kind of tie into what the city is looking for in terms of sustainability. So a lot of emphasis on climate change and reducing our energy consumption and being more energy efficient, but also building healthy buildings and green buildings, using less toxic materials, things that are also going to improve our watershed health and improve biodiversity. We also have a lot of social equity programs, whether that's MW, ESB utilization, or looking farther into our supply chain and trying to make sure we're not utilizing products that are made with sweatshop labor. So there's lots of different ways to engage with the city on sustainability issues and things that we buy. Because of that, we did establish a sustainable procurement program here at the city in 2002, which is the program that I am responsible for. Next. So just to provide a little more context when I'm talking about sustainable procurement, I've grabbed the definitions that are used for sustainable procurement in the ISO guideline for sustainable procurement that was published earlier this year. Just to emphasize again that when we're talking about sustainable procurement, the goal is to be thinking about how that procurement is making the most positive environmental, social, and economic impacts possible over an entire life cycle. So it's a very big idea, it's a very ambitious goal, and therefore there's a lot of opportunities there for making that positive difference when thinking about sustainable procurement. It also impacts, we're not just thinking about the product or service, we're trying to also think more about the types of suppliers and the supply chain and how sustainable those are. All because, again, we recognize that sustainable procurement has a role in trying to achieve our organizational sustainability objectives that I mentioned earlier, whether it's, again, reducing our energy usage or trying to improve the health of our communities and our employees by buying less toxic materials, any of those kinds of overall sustainability goals. Next slide. So, and as mentioned earlier, cities buy a lot of different things, and we are definitely no exception to that. And so there does have to be some prioritization, and there has to be an ability to focus, because we can't possibly tackle everything that the city buys in terms of engaging on sustainable procurement. So we are looking for opportunities of greatest impact. That's where we're going to focus. So either that's the large multi-department contracts that everybody uses, like furniture or cleaning supplies. They have a large amount of spend. Or it could be just because of the magnitude of the issue, has great opportunities, such as street lighting, a large opportunity there to make that more efficient. We'll also focus obviously on things where we're specifically directed and policy to focus on. And then there's also lots of opportunities in just what I would call low-hanging fruit. So anything where there's an existing green product standard or certification. So examples there are like green cleaning supplies. There's a couple different standards for green cleaning supplies, whether we're talking about Green Seal or the EPA's Safer Choice program. There's existing best practices out there from a community of organizations that are working on sustainable procurement. Other agencies have developed a best practice that can easily be replicated elsewhere. And perhaps there's also already a greener service or good already available on the market, which makes that, again, a nice opportunity for us to engage on that. And also, wherever the cost or benefit of going with a more sustainable option is easily understood, that makes also a really good opportunity for us to engage our departments on that particular commodity or service. Next slide. So how do we develop a particular a more sustainable specification? Like how do we integrate green or more social equity specifications into our solicitations? So again, we'll reference existing standards or certifications for that. We'll reference best practices established by our community of practice. We'll sometimes our policies are very specific on what we need to do. For example, we have a policy on buying recycled content paper, so that's pretty explicit already that we're going to buy a certain percent recycled content paper products. But where those don't exist, we will be doing research. We'll research the impacts and the benefits. We'll research market availability. We'll seek stakeholder input from our departments. All those kinds of avenues are what we do to try to figure out, okay, how can we push the envelope? How can we get a less toxic, a more energy efficient, a more socially just a product or service in a particular category, depending on what is most relevant for that particular product or service. When it comes to kind of addressing more of that sustainable company or supply chain issues, that is much harder. It's something that I would say in general, the public sector hasn't done a lot of yet, other than I would say looking at MWESB utilization or buying local or things of that nature. Looking more farther into supply chains is not something that we've done a ton of, more common in the private sector, but it is an evolving issue, and I think there's more community interest, at least here in Portland, on looking at our supply chains and looking for, how could we possibly tackle that particular issue. So next slide, please. So once we've decided we have that specification in place, it gets either integrated directly into our technical requirements and our scope of work, especially if, and that again could be either in a low bid or a RFP scenario. And then if it's an RFP, we may also integrate sustainability related questions into the evaluation criteria, in which case proposers can earn points for the sustainability of their practices, of their product or service. And then also, at least here in the city, we have in all our RFPs a corporate responsibility section, which is made up of a lot of MWESB related questions and community engagement questions, but also some questions regarding the sustainability practices of the business. Next. So to wrap up so that we have some time for questions, and some things to know about when talking with a city or an agency about sustainable procurement. As Katja mentioned, it's important to know what their goals are around sustainability, where their prioritizations lie, because again, that as mentioned earlier, sustainability can mean a lot of different things, and there could be a particular focus that a agency is prioritizing. But be careful not to do what I would call greenwashing. If you're in this industry at all and you've been working on sustainable procurement or sustainability, greenwashing can be a big turnoff. So you don't know exactly what I mean by greenwashing. I suggest you read some of the FTC green guides and the environmental marketing guidelines that the FTC puts out. Always try to be very specific in your claims and back them up. I'm always interested, for example, when I'm talking with vendors, to know, okay, so you're energy efficient. What does that mean? Is it Energy Star? Is it, what is it? Where's your performance? How does it compare to industry average? Things along those lines. It could also be look for opportunities for being a partner in pilot testing something, especially if you know that that's quite a change for what that agency's been doing for the past 20 years. However, you should know going into pilot testing that sole sources aren't extremely common, and that likely competition is still going to be the outcome. Being part of a pilot doesn't guarantee some sort of sole source contract. Ways to get involved further and learn more about the sustainable procurement or just procurement in general of a particular agency, to attend some vendor fairs. Here in Oregon, we, for example, have a reverse vendor trade show where it's the public agencies sitting at booths and the vendors get to come in and talk and ask questions of all the procurement agencies. Public procurement networks and conferences, National Association of State Procurement Officials, a National Institute of Government Professionals. Oh shoot, now I've totally lost my mind, what NGP stands for. But anyway, so these conferences generally have vendor trade shows as well, and are opportunities to engage directly with public procurement professionals. There are obviously lots of green specific related conferences that can be very trade specific or audience specific, but there will be public agency representatives there at those conferences many times, and it's an opportunity to network that way. And then, as I mentioned, there is a community practice around sustainable procurement, institutional purchasing in particular, The Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, or SPLC, is kind of leading the charge in that. They're a nonprofit that engages nonprofits, private and public sectors on this topic of institutional sustainable procurement and best practices and guidelines along that topic. So next slide. So this is my contact information. If you have more questions about sustainable procurement, SPLC, what the city does for sustainable procurement, you can also go to our website, portlandoregon.gov/buy-green, to see, a list of all those policies that we have, some of our case studies on sustainable procurement, a lot of information there to review if you're interested.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy. One question that I have is, so in the policy you mentioned that the goals are kind of threefold, both environmental, social, and economic, when thinking about how to make purchasing more sustainable. So I was wondering if you could talk generally of how kind of those other goals are met as well, if those are kind of other people in a central purchasing office, or if that's something that, or if all three of those things are kind of considered in the larger purchasing decisions.
Well, I think it will depend a little bit on the commodity or service, kind of where that focus lies. I think a lot of times when we're researching a particular specification, whether it's like, say, green cleaning products, you're looking to see not only what cost difference there might be in terms of switching from one a conventional cleaner to a more sustainable, less toxic cleaner, but then you're looking to see what kind of impacts those things have. So the social may come in the side of, okay, so your janitors are exposed to less toxic chemicals. Are you able to quantify that? Maybe, the benefit, the health benefit there, maybe not, but it's part of the dialogue you have with your stakeholders when deciding to make that change. The cost impact there may not be any particular cost impact, but it's something to research in terms of market availability and what other agencies have experienced prior to making such a change. So how specific you get on hitting all three of those areas on a particular commodity or service will vary, but that's the goal, to try to look at all those areas when doing it. But sometimes resources and policy interests, focus more heavily on one than the other. Just kind of depends.
Great, thank you. And then remember, if you have questions, you can submit them through our question function. So if anyone listening has questions for Satya, please let us know. We have one question come in talking about what represents a large purchase, what value, if that, maybe Stacey, you could talk about that specifically for Portland, and then Satya, if you could maybe answer that question a little bit more generally, that would be great.
Right, so at the City of Portland, it will vary a little bit about the type of service or good. For goods and services, we trigger the formal solicitation level at $150,000. So that's, if you anticipate spending at least that much in one fiscal year, then that triggers a formal solicitation process. It's a lower dollar threshold for professional services or construction services.
Yeah, I think that's a common approach, but the actual dollar amount will vary. I think often in relationship to the size of the local government, or maybe more accurately, the size of their budget. So, there are some places where that sort of formal solicitation level will be, at 100,000, or maybe even some that it would be at 50,000. and there are some places where you can only spend maybe $5,000 to $10,000 without having a formal process or getting approval, and then there'll be other places where that number goes upwards of 25, 30, maybe even 50. I think it's really mostly relates to the size of the budget and the sort of impact on the budget that a purchase would have.
Great. Thank you both so much. So the second question, Satya, is for you. And Stacey might have some thoughts on this as well after, but thinking about what's the most compelling reason or value proposition that local governments are using to switch to more sustainable purchasing or engage with more sustainable requirements, and kind of thinking about what's actually getting their attention, if it's brands or efficiency or savings, if there's one of those things that seems to really outweigh all the others.
I mean, I guess I can only really answer that anecdotally at this point, but my sense is that what drives the purchasing preferences in general, and I think also very much sustainable purchasing, and Stacey, I'd be interested in hearing your response to this specifically for your city, but I think it is mostly values-based. And so, for example, we worked on a local purchasing preference with Madison, Wisconsin, and that was really about the city's desire to support local businesses and the local economy sort of preferentially. It wasn't, it actually didn't end up being that much of an impact in terms of staff time or sort of administrative lift, but it could have ended up costing them more, and it did shift some purchasing decisions. So it was really a values-based decision. Similarly, cities that have, for example, a sweat-free purchasing policy, and for folks that aren't familiar with that, it's about how clothing is made, so that it's a desire to not buy clothing that's made in sweatshops. So for cities that have a sweat-free purchasing policy, that is, totally values-based, and it often will cost them more to get apparel that is certified as sweat-free, but they consider it worth it because of the value that they're representing with those purchases. Some of it, I think, particularly on the sort of sustainable or environmentally friendly side, might have to do with health, worker health, environmental health, or in some cases efficiency. But I think overall, and again, Stacey, I'd be interested in your take. I think it is rooted in values.
I would agree that in general it's rooted in values, although I think there's also some pretty strong business cases to be made. In some cases you might be reducing risk or your exposure to risk. It could be also that you're also just making a more longer term investment. I think that's true of a lot of more green building or in environment energy efficiency practices. So you can make a very strong business case that your return on investment is really strong. So in terms of what drives people to do sustainable procurement, it could be a variety of factors. I think it depends a little bit on the audience. I know it varies on my internal audience, even here at the city. The city as a whole has a very strong message and policies around climate change, for example, but people are also very interested in not exposing, kids in our community centers to toxic chemicals. So all those kinds of things factor into, when I talk with folks about sustainable procurement, I'm going to try to factor in where their value is and what kind of just drives their decision making, and that can vary a little bit even within the scope of our policies. So it will vary by agency, but in general, I would agree that it's value based.
Great. And kind of as a follow-up to that, we have another question for you, Stacy, asking kind of where you're getting the most internal support for the sustainable procurement work that you're doing, and if there are certain people within the city who really see the value in this, you know, if it comes from the top or if it's being really driven by maybe your office.
The support comes from a few different places, so I would say it comes from the top in the sense that our elected officials have supported this work. They have passed a variety of policies along those lines. We also have even though I'm in the procurement office, we also have an office of sustainability, and they lend support and advocate for this work because they understand how it fits in. It's one piece of meeting the city's overall sustainability goals. And then also we do get support directly in within our procurement office. As I mentioned, I'm housed in our procurement office, and I think that in itself demonstrates that support for this work. And lastly, I would say there's also community support. There is engagement here at the City of Portland directly with some local nonprofits on sustainable procurement, and in particular on toxics and buying less toxic materials and how that ripples into the community.
Great. We have another question on how cities prioritize the development of sustainability education programs in both public and also local school procurement budgets. Is that something that either of you have had experience with?
Well, I think just for context, most cities don't control their school districts. So it's a rare case across the country where the city government will also be the entity that's governing the schools. And so mostly a city wouldn't have any opportunity to tell a school district how to spend its money. That said, I think that there are some cities that you see doing more sort of educational work around sustainability. I don't think anybody is doing any huge programming around that, but I think there are definitely some cities that are emphasizing different sort of pieces of sustainability. You know, for example, there are cities that have efforts around encouraging walking and biking or encouraging taking transit. There are some cities that, many cities that have done work on building energy efficiency and encouraging the private sector to make private buildings more energy efficient. So I think that what you mostly see is sort of not necessarily a broad-based sort of sustainability education campaign, but a smaller focus on a particular aspect of sustainability that a city is really engaging with and is trying to get the public in that place to engage with as well.
Great. Thank you both so much. So that was our last question. If anyone else has any last questions, please submit them now. I just want to thank both Stacy and Satya for participating today. I know I learned a lot about how to sell to my local city government, so hopefully you all did as well. If anyone has any questions following the presentation, feel free to email me. My email's up on the screen now. And I can pass those along to Stacy and Satya if you didn't get their emails. Again, Satya is with the Mayor's Innovation Project, and Stacy works for the City of Portland. If you have any questions about ASBC, you can visit our site or email me as well directly about those. And so I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so I think that I will wrap everything up. Thank you both again, Stacy and Satya, for your presentation, and everyone for your participation on the questions. And finally, the recording of the webinar will be up on our website later this week. So if you would like to reference it or share it with someone else, please do so. And that will be at asbcouncil.org/webinars. And you'll get that in an email as well. So thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks very much, Eliza. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.